Now, I have some slides, so the first thing I'm going to do is check they're all working. Yes, good start. So we have been conducting this research for a number of years, and I'm going to set out just a little bit more about the key objectives of the research and the methodology that we conduct, so they're really clear where these insights are coming from. So our objectives are always to track the reputation of the finance and related professional services industry, and also with policymakers and parliamentarians who we interview for this research to understand the key priorities that they have at that point in time, as well as their perceptions of the industry and how they see the industry having a role in supporting them with those priorities, and thinking about the types of narratives or actions that they want to know more about or that they find particularly salient. And we also explore some of these themes with the public in terms of the methodology. For those of you who are not research savvy, this might be boring, I apologize, but it's important to know kind of where these insights have come from. In terms of the policymakers, we interview regulators, MPs, lords. We purposefully ensure that there's a spread of party affiliations. Each year we interview 20 of these representatives, and these are quite open narrative interviews. They're a conversation, and they are anonymous, so we will have quotes from these people, but we don't say exactly who they are, so they can be as open as they like in these discussions. We also conduct a nationally representative online survey with structured questions with the UK public, with over 2,000 members of the UK public, to understand their perceptions as well. So I think it is worth flagging this year was a little bit of a surprise. We knew an election was likely to happen, but not necessarily exactly when it happened in the summer, just as we were doing all of the interviews. So it is also, I think, important to flag and highlight that we began conducting the interviews pre-election. We knew it was likely to happen, but not necessarily when it did. And then we conducted the final set of 10 interviews after the general election. So people knew it was likely to happen, but we did have a slight split then in the sample of people looking forward to those who actually were now in that reality of a new government. And we conducted the survey with the public post-general election as well. But this was in August, so it can feel like almost a lot has happened since then already. It's also worth flagging that, of course, there's a huge number of other contextual factors, as well as the election, which sort of loomed large this year. As we were conducting the interviews over the summer, we can't forget there was protests in the UK, there was riots in the UK. It has felt like a time of real instability the last couple of years, and that sort of came through in some of the interviews. There's a huge amount of geopolitical instability as well as a backdrop to some of these conversations. And in discussing finance, many of the themes that have already emerged this morning, we heard again in these interviews, discussions around the regulatory landscape and the complexity of some of the regulatory landscape also came up repeatedly. So there's a number of contextual factors as a backdrop to these insights. And there are 4 key findings that I will talk through this morning. The first is that this new government has brought a sense of much needed change, but which direction it then goes in is still kind of open to debate. It brings opportunities, but for some it also potentially brings risks. The industry reputation, though, I would say is fairly healthy, and that's a good news story that I'll go into in some more detail. We hear similar themes each year about why it is that the industry is so valued, but I'll show some statistics that I think also show it's in a really positive upward trajectory with the public as well. But part of my job is to not just paint a rosy picture of things, that's not particularly helpful for strategy. It's also to look at the challenges that may lie ahead. And there are some key challenges that policymakers called out. Regulation and risk. Regulation's already come up this morning. Regulation potentially driving sort of risk aversion, as we've just heard, as it created an environment whereby people feel inhibited to innovate or take risks. We also heard about a potential erosion of global standing, and listings came up in that area too. And also the challenge of making moves towards sort of genuinely more green finance. So a number of challenges I'll outline in some more detail too. And finally, though, what we did hear in this year of the election was that there is a real commitment amongst the policymakers of whatever party affiliation to work with the industry, a real recognition of the power and strength of the industry, and some key themes that emerged as to ways in which they wanted to do so. So, we have a new government, but what next? Well, there are some key opportunities that have been brought up in the interviews of policymakers. Time and time again, when we do the analysis, I try and draw out where are we hearing similar terminology, similar wording. Stability kept coming up, that there will be a time of stability, particularly in comparison to what felt like a very unstable years preceding this year, and that stability would enable the opportunity to think about long-term growth. And they were both seen as real key sort of opportunity areas as we go into the new kind of year following this election. Also, there are some practical new opportunities that new MPs bring in forging those relationships, in helping to be partners with those MPs. Many of the newer MPs I interviewed were really keen to learn. They're keen to talk to industry experts, and they're keen to be able to use that expertise in thinking about their day-to-day roles as well and how that could support their constituents. So there's a new opportunity with some new actors to engage with as well. Now, these are popular every year, the word clouds. These are where we've asked people which word they would use to describe the industry, both the public and the policymakers. And we always see quite positive words from policymakers. We say it's significant, it's professional, London, the economy. I've also put in the word clouds from previous years on the slides too, in smaller, because I think what an interesting trend this year, if we look at this one from the public, we actually have seen greedy diminish. And I think there's something interesting about the public really seeing the professionalisation of the industry and moving away from, I think, quite hackneyed tropes about, fat cat bankers. The crash is a distant memory of 2008 for many people. We found trust was higher amongst younger people, for example. I think this just has less salience and relevance to them, and the industry, therefore, has been quite rehabilitated for the public. And so they fall back on what they know about the industry, but we're seeing maybe some of the negative perceptions diminish. And that's very positive. Now, there's always a lot going on these slides, so bear with me and I'll explain them in a little more detail. But the green, this is our tracking slides around trust in the finance and related professional services industry. And the dark green is this year, and the lighter greens are the other years sort of before. So you can see any upward trajectories or any change in those patterns. And what's interesting, every year we see my own bank or my own insurance provider has a much higher level of trust. Now, there's a simple psychological explanation for that, is that it would probably seem quite strange for somebody to say they don't trust their bank. They have touch points and communications with that provider. It would beg the question, if you don't trust them, why are you with them? So we always see in research the institutions or brands that people are directly connecting with, they often feel more positive towards, and we see that trend there. But we still see an increase in 4%, up 4% in that level of trust with my own bank at the highest level. Going down the line, we see up 8% levels of trust in bank and banking in the UK, and also up 6% the financial services industry in the UK. That's really quite positive upticks. You can see by the darker lines, it's more this year than it's tended to be in previous years, but the trajectory has been going up. And unfortunately for law firms in the UK, that pattern is not quite the same. It stayed the same from last year. So it's not getting worse, it's not bad, but it stayed the same, and also insurance providers only up 2%. Now, the reason for calling that out is not only perhaps that it points towards some aspects of the sector still having a bit more work to do in telling their narratives of their value, but I think it also shows that those sort of 8% increases are genuine increases. It's not just a false positive because everyone was feeling a bit more positive about everything. It's genuinely that banks and the banking sector is more trusted now by the public, and I think that's a really positive trend. So we also, last year, asked about some other bodies like the UK government and the tech industry. And we saw last year, in 2003, trust was really low in the UK government. And we did see an increase post-election in the level of trust in the government. I think worth highlighting, though, even post-election, only 25% of the UK public saying they trusted the government. So trust is fairly low. And again, it's worth highlighting that high levels of trust, relatively speaking, in this financial sector is very positive, because this is a time when trust is very low about many, many institutions. And we're not always seeing that uptick in some other sectors. And trust, as you can see, was fairly low in the UK government. There are slightly more bad news in terms of what's happened since, and that we also do our own research with Politics Home. And 100 days after the election did some polling. And what this shows, it's actually the same years we've been tracking at TheCityUK, although this is our own polling. We asked a question about how positive people feel about the UK or otherwise. And you can see there was a bit of an uptick post-election, but it's kind of nosedived to how positive people are feeling about the UK now too. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. I think the UK public are still feeling there's a lot of challenges out there. So the industry, however, is still seen as a real powerhouse. And there's some really positive messages to take out of this. And these are the themes I'm sure you'll want to discuss today about how you capitalise on that. Each year, Here are some similar themes about why it is that the industry is seen to be so vitally important. First of all, it's seen to be a real success on a global scale. This quote up here talking about, world leading. We've been a place for investment for the last 400 years. That comes through from policymakers time and time again. The second key point is that it's a powerhouse as a UK economy and a recognition that really drives the economy, that brings in investment from overseas, and without it, the economy would not be in the position it is in, although, as we've heard this morning, perhaps more can be done. It's still valued as a sector. And thirdly, another theme that I think came through this year more than it has in past years, is a sense that it has been a success story as a sector, whilst many other sectors are actually now seen much more negatively. That's not happened to finance and related professional services sector, and actually they're seen to have really shown the professional side, moved on from the crash of 2008, and are in a very different place. And that's seen also as positive amongst policymakers. And the UK public agree, as you can see from some of these stats. And I'm looking up, by the way, because the screen there isn't actually showing the slides. So, so you can see from some of these stats, 65% agree that financial and related professional services companies in the UK bring valuable income to the UK economy. So the public recognise that value too. We've pulled out specific regional stats for West Midlands there, and you see they're very aligned with the overall average, and I would say fairly positive as well. They agree at 61% that the financial and related professional services companies do well. The UK and the UK economy does well. What's also flagging from a research perspective is this grey bar. Now, the grey bar are sort of undecided, people don't know, and that's quite high as well. Very few, only a small proportion, are disagreeing that finance and related professional services industries are not doing something positive to the UK. They're either undecided or agreeing. So that, again, is a positive view from the public. But as I said, there are specific challenges to address, and I think these are really important for thinking about future strategy as well. And I'm sorry I don't have any answers for these challenges. I will only leave you with some challenges, but they are important challenges to consider, and I know some of these have already come up this morning. The first, this was from policymakers, was this sense of regulation and risk aversion. Now, we've, I think, already even heard the terminology previously that there's maybe unintended consequences from regulation. What has been well-meaning, what has been positive when it was brought in, might have led to unintended consequences. And I heard that in the interviews as well, as you can see from one of these quotes here. The sense that regulation is important, but is it working effectively now? Are we in a place where it's really driving, for example, the growth that it should, the necessary need for risk that it should? Do we need to disentangle some of these unintended consequences, and has it brought about a risk-averse mindset that is inhibiting growth? These were questions really posed quite stridently by some of the policymakers that I spoke to, and that was, again, from across party affiliations. A second key challenge raised was a sense of an erosion of global standing. So we're still seen very positively globally, but that this might be diminishing and that other jurisdictions may be coming through even stronger. And a very specific example that kept coming up was about the UK being an attractive place for listings and the need to ensure it's an attractive place for listings. And so again, some specific things to consider around how we face head on to some of the challenges that policymakers were raising. And the third challenge, and it was very much posed as a challenge, was this need for a more sustainable approach. And on multiple occasions in interviews from different policymakers, they spoke about the need for the industry to really lay out how they would de-invest in fossil fuels, amongst one of the many challenges facing this consideration of sustainability. But they also recognise it's a challenge. They weren't saying this is easy. Why it was flagged as a challenge was saying because this won't be easy, but we feel it needs to happen. So all of these are tensions and challenges to consider, and I think really tackle head on in the future, that are recognised by policymakers as something that the industry is and needs to really be grappling with. And there are some other areas to consider working on too, as we heard from these. There is still a consideration that even more can be done to protect consumers, that more needs to be done to protect consumers, and a sense that Labour really is listening and really does want to work with the industry, but that is still a sort of early stage of the new government. So how do we harness these opportunities effectively? So, what do policymakers really want to see the industry? They want to see the industry have a real commitment to working with government, and we heard that from across, again, political affiliations. The need to work together at this point is so important, and a real openness from the Labour MPs that I interviewed to do so, and a sense that across the political affiliations that we really need to if we're going to help the economy and help UK society, and that's what they want to hear and see the industry do. It's a moment of real opportunity because there is this recognition, as we've heard this morning, of this symbiotic relationship. Now, these are both comments that were made by Conservatives, the representatives that I interviewed, but they recognise and call out that to help solve some of the challenges with public spending, to really drive growth, we have to create an environment where this industry can thrive. It is vital, it is essential. So we have to be working together with the government. But in these instances, they were also perhaps a little more sceptical of, but does the new government really feel as open to this industry? Is there a tension inherent there? Having spoken to Labour MPs also, they say they absolutely are and absolutely do want to work with industry and do recognise the importance that the industry will play now and in the future to the economy and to the growth agenda. But it is still early days, and that's why this is a moment of great opportunity. And what specifically do they want to see happening and working on together? The first, as I mentioned, is however we want to phrase it, green finance, some of the challenges. Not only de-investment in fossil fuels, but also thinking about, for example, green productivity, and what that might mean for investment, and a real sense, they say, to tackle this head on because it is a challenge, but a desire to have set out what that will look like and how that will happen. The second key area, which I think is very relevant to today, is regional growth and investment. But this was also, again, I think linking back to some of the earlier panels, thinking about how does this help benefit many more people? How is this also part of an inclusion agenda? Be that through skills, be that through outreach in schools, not just investment in regional areas, but in a way that is actually genuinely benefiting all different types of people in that community as effectively as possible, was the themes that were coming through there. And the third key area is this sense of better finance for all. Now, this again comes up every year, and ostensibly, this is about financial education, financial inclusion. But this year, what I heard, which was different, was this connection of the circularity of the importance of the public having better financial education because we have challenges such as so many people with excess cash because they're worried about investing, for example, or because people are not sure where or how their pensions should be invested. We actually have a huge amount of capital that could be used for investment that isn't being used effectively. And if we could educate and engage the public more effectively, then actually we could free this up. So it's helping people individually to have better financial inclusion, but a real recognition this is important for the overall economy as well. And how do we actually address that, though, remains a challenge. I do lots of research with consumers as well, and it is a real challenge because people care about money and their finances, but it is really difficult to engage them in some of these details. So it is a remaining challenge, but it's an important one to think about and something that policymakers I interviewed kept bringing up time and time again as an important part of that agenda. And the public agree. Coming back to the public views, they agree with 51% agreeing that encouraging more financial and related professional services companies to open offices in my area would be a good thing. Here we have the West Midlands stats. You can see very similar levels generally. What's interesting is toward the bottom here, this is where maybe there's some areas still to work on. These bottom questions were statements such as financial and related professional services companies behave in an ethical way. Actually, this is where we start to see more disagreement, sort of agreement and disagreement. But actually, you are well thought of in the West Midlands, slightly higher agreement than the West Midlands. And similarly, the point at the bottom about financial and related professional service companies care about the communities they work in. Higher level of disagreement here, but actually higher agreement in the West Midlands. But perhaps something still to work on, given what we've heard from policymakers about the importance of this social contract, of an industry that is so powerful and seen to be so successful, actually doing the right thing, being ethical as well. Now, you might think, well, is that really an industry's role? But it is a really important part of this new social contract, and it shows from these stats, it's where there's probably areas still to work on with the public too. So, what are the implications that this have? The implication is that there are high expectations on the industry. There are high expectations, and some of that leads to tensions, where, perhaps you could do a little bit more of this, but by doing that, you have to do a little bit less of that. How do you strike that balance? There's lots of challenges that I've been able to raise, but I'm afraid I haven't been able to give you any easy answers. But these high expectations are because the industry is recognised as being so powerful, and because it's recognised as having so much clout. So actually, it's a positive kind of indicator of your standing that there's such high expectations on what this industry can achieve. The second key set of implications is that there are some themes to meet head on that we know are really challenging. Green finance, financial education, regulation. There's a lot obviously going to be going on with regulation now and in the future, and it did come up as a theme in many of the interviews, but again, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that challenge, but it does need to be addressed. But the third key implication that I think is really positive is that the crash of 2008 does seem like a distant memory to many people. We just heard how important it is that some people can continue to have face-to-face banking. I agree. But actually, for many of the public, this industry has been a real success in terms of digitization. People love their banking app. They love fintech. They feel more in control. They actually have quite warm feelings towards their bank and how they're able to be helped with their banking. So there's some real positives. But actually, this should never drive complacency. As we look ahead to the future, they're in a really strong position, both in terms of how the public and policymakers feel about the industry and the value that you can bring and the role that you can have in that future. But there's never space for complacency when we've also seen so many complex challenges that also still need to be addressed. Thank you.
Well, Carol, thank you very much. I mean, that was an absolute masterclass and some deep insights. I think, the absolute centrality of our industry to economic growth, to green transition, the importance of moving on and the fact we're moving on a bit from the financial crash, and a more mature approach, shall we say, and proportionate approach to regulation and risk. So there's a lot to draw from your stats and your interviews. There's a few questions coming through. Keep them coming forward. I'm going to start, though, with a little bit, as we're in Birmingham, of a dive into the West Midlands. Our Enabling Growth report, I think, shows that this is a very important sector for the West Midlands, a big employer, a big driver of growth. And we come through in the West Midlands as being in line and slightly ahead in some areas of the rest of the country. Is there more, do you think, that you've derived from your conversations that we need to focus on delivering regional and local growth? Can we be more closer to our communities and places?
I think so, yes. I think it's never easy. But first of all, maybe people in the West Midlands are just very nice. But we did see a slightly more positive perception of the industry regionally, although it was very aligned generally with the national picture. So there's an openness, I think, to the value of the industry in this region. And we should be thinking, as we heard this morning, about some of the specific differences by regions. Now, what our figures tend to show is there are not huge differences by region on things like trust. So there's opportunities there across the country. But exactly what that looks like has to be cast in that sort of local community knowledge. And as I said, one of the things that came out is how do you make those connections to people for whom the industry may seem quite alien? A lot of the public really don't understand the ins and outs of finance or the finance industry unless they know someone who's worked in it. How do you open up those opportunities and that understanding to those broader communities, both to help their understanding, which may inadvertently also help with sort of financial inclusion, understanding of finances more broadly, but as an employer, as an area of opportunity, as something that is potentially accessible to all, to help think about the skills that are required. I think that's some ways to really help connect your community. And the more people know somebody who is working within a sector as well, the more you have this halo effect of understanding the value of it.
So we all have to be ambassadors,
yes,
I guess,
absolutely.
for our sector. I'm going to turn to one of the questions from the audience here, which I think is a terrific question, which is about this point about proportionate risk. And the ask is, did we see anywhere in the data some evidence that policymakers and the general public want to be less risk averse? I mean, how did that transmit in your conversations?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because the word risk, I think, has become quite synonymous with being something negative. And actually, of course, the actual meaning of risk is not necessarily negative. No. It's risk. It could go either way. So I do think there's a bit of a job to be done around the mental models that the public, but less so policymakers, I think, but the mental models the public hold just about the concept of risk. Even when you talk about investing, people are worried about the risk it might go down and ignore the risk it could go up, which is actually the real positives of it. Don't sit on your excess cash. I think that there was obviously a much more nuanced understanding of that, I felt, amongst some of the policymakers, but it's still really difficult to calibrate where that line is. And if I kind of probed on that, they would kind of pass it back and say, well, that's going to be for the industry to work out. So that's where I think the challenge still lies, that there's conversations to be had, a lot of thinking to be done about what that actually looks like. And of course, it'll be different for different parts of the sector as well.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely comes through in the pension review, for example, doesn't it? That we need to now start to focus on value, not just cost. And value is what is the return to the pensioner, and to earn those returns, you need to take a little bit of measured and understood and proportionate risk. So I think that is working. The test, I think, will come, and be interesting to see what the politicians say about this going forward. The test will come when they start getting letters because there's been some risk taken somewhere and something hasn't worked out. And does that then, one failure, does that sort of outweigh all the benefits of a slightly risk-on approach?
Yeah, I mean, that's really true. A lot of what came up, again, also was a lot of concern about investment frauds that have been happening for the public. The reason that happens is because they don't know enough about investing. To them, it could just be a bad investment. It ends up, it's a fraud. That is, some MPs felt we really need to address that. But, how do you effectively grapple with that when it's such a grey area between people being open to more risk, but not that type of risk that actually turns out to be a scam? So there's definitely a bit of a tightrope to be walked on how it's done, because there is always a risk of there being some scandals and people really having negative experiences. And then the other is sort of unregulated investments such as crypto. For the public too, sometimes they lump it all together and will think, and we do hear of people sort of losing huge amounts in crypto. They don't understand the type of risk with that. So it's a really difficult landscape to think about how we encourage that sort of proportionate risk. But I think when it comes to more the wholesale investing, it's a different landscape, and that's perhaps where it is more something the industry can lead on and work with government to think about where are those lines.
Well, it may well be somewhere, an area where we need to tell our story better, because risk is not just going and put money on a horse in the 330. It's about actual in-depth analysis and understanding, weighing the pros and cons, and making a reasoned judgment about what you think is going to happen, and based on a large amount of research and deep thinking. So we probably need to explain ourselves very, very clearly about what we mean by risk. So I'll just move on to another question here, which is actually again on this risk subject, which is whether your insight suggests the public, as opposed to the policymakers, are ready for responsible risk-taking, either individually or collectively. I mean, is there a divergence between policymakers and public on this, do you think?
Yeah, as I mentioned, previously, I think the level of understanding is very different. So the policymakers are already much further ahead in that curve of understanding what it means and why it matters, and that bigger picture about it. Whereas for the public, the understanding of risk is much more mired in their day-to-day. And we can't, and I don't mean this to downplay the public either, but we can't underestimate the fact that for a vast majority of the public who don't work in finance, money is important to them, but they don't really think about finance. They don't really understand finance. And I'd say it's not to downplay them. They've got busy lives. They're doing other things. So expecting them to really understand some of these nuances does have to come with a lot of education. I think what's interesting is when the policymakers are on board, but it's having those kind of now discussions and dialogue with them about what it means. But they understand there's a real need to address this sense of risk aversion and the negative impact that they feel it could be having on the industry. So they're really open to that conversation, and I think aware of that. So
broadening out a little bit, or moving on from risk, but it's the connected subject of economic growth. I mean, I think it comes through very strongly, from your research that, government and policymakers absolutely understand that we are, front and center of delivering growth as a sector, and they have to relate to us on that basis. But there's a question here which I think is a really interesting one, which the questioner says, it's positive our industry is viewed as central to delivering growth, but it also creates a challenge. Do we get the blame if growth doesn't materialize in 2 years' time? So are too many eggs in one basket, do you think, in policymaker land?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, no one can ever win these days, can they? There'll be a big politician, there'll be a petition going round saying, like, get rid of the whole industry. Yes, there is that danger. But I actually think people realise it's more nuanced than that. I think the government still has more challenges in terms of their reputation and the extent to which the public trust them. I think the industry is seen as important when it comes to growth, but so are other industries. Energy gets spoken about a lot, for example, as well. There's always a need to be aware of potential backlashes and future narratives. One thing I've seen, as we've all seen probably over the last few years, is there will always be someone who is a critic. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do things. You know, I don't think the industry will be held fully responsible for what happens next. And in fact, we know there'll be many, many factors involved in how the economy performs next. If the industry has done what it feels is the right thing and has its evidence behind it as to why that is the right thing, I think that is the absolute best it can do. And doing nothing is worse. I think there was a quote I read today in a report saying, you know, if you do nothing, you can't be blamed because you've done nothing. So I would say do something. And if you get a bit of blame, if you've done what you think is the right thing, you've at least done something. Doing nothing is even worse. Don't worry about the blame.
Yeah, to sort of have a plan, any plan. But no, I think that actually underscores the point. Growth and risk are so intertwined in this, and doing nothing is sort of erring into the territory that our chairman, Anne Richards, described as reckless prudence. It's a fantastic phrase, and it just encapsulates it. So, you know, we do need to have, you know, a strong story, a good narrative, you know, a reasoned set of arguments to go forward. And you know, while not over-promising, we frankly are crucial to the growth agenda. A sort of practical question here has come through, and this is, how can the industry work with policymakers to further highlight our industry's role, importance, opportunities, and challenges? Practical tips, I think, on what we should do.
I mean, some of the new MPs I interviewed, obviously there's one we've mentioned a few times, who used to sit with me, Emma, who's like, you know, you have good connections with already.
My predecessor.
Yes. So there are some MPs who are very well connected with the industry and with your agenda, but there were others who did feel all ears, like open to learning, but acknowledge they don't really know a lot about the industry. They're having to pick up a lot of new things. Their key priority at this point is their constituents. So I think as much outreach as you can do in actually sometimes sort of not just preaching to the converted, but getting out there to those who are less engaged with the industry or have less familiarity with the industry, because they do want to learn and they are open to learning, and they you know, are open to hearing those narratives and understanding what it means for them. Again, in that sort of absence of that information, they have to fill the gaps in. This one example I'm thinking of in particular, they were, as I mentioned, really concerned about investment fraud amongst their constituents. In the absence of hearing anything from the industry about how that's being tackled, all they're going to hear about is from their constituents. So as much different kind of outreach as possible, connecting to the things that matter to them, making sure you're reaching people who perhaps, for example, have been critical of the industry in the past because they don't know a lot about the industry. You know, not doing the engagement, obviously, with people who are supporters, but making sure you're kind of reaching out as well. I think it's really important at this point.
No, and we are very much doing that on our members' behalf. So, you know, the last election produced a big turnover in the House of Commons, a lot of new MPs, not very many of which have worked in financial services, less than in the past, and not very many actually have worked in business. So there is quite an educational job to do. There are some real experts, but not very many of them. And so we are going through a very thorough outreach process to MPs and their researchers as well. The researcher is obviously always quite critical in getting the message through. So yes, be assured we are doing that. And that kind of gets me to another very interesting question that has come in. I don't know if policymakers commented on this, but the question is, do the policymakers in Parliament and government see the role that they play in changing regulation? I mean, I guess the remit letter that Tulip mentioned is part of that, but do they understand the regulators, you know, exist in many ways at their behest?
To some extent, I think. I did hear some echoes of critique around the current sort of regulatory system from some politicians, and therefore the need for reform. And I think a recognition that will have to come to some extent from policymakers. But again, when sort of pushed, there's also a sense that we need industry to step up and talk to us about what's going to work or not work. So again, I guess it's always about that partnership and collaboration point. But they do ultimately recognise that it sits with policymakers and the government, but through a sort of, as actually we heard, sort of co-design, and that the co-design element of it is what's so important, but it will ultimately sit with them. And I think what was interesting this year, every year something about regulation comes up, but I think this year in particular, this sense of a need for reform and change and sort of measured thought through reform and change definitely came through from policymakers. And they do realise they have a role in that, but it isn't a top-down role, it's a co-design role.
Yes, and a sense, I guess, that the policymaker can't really get away with saying that is a matter for the regulator, nothing to do with me.
Yes,
because they do have an oversight.
But I think
role
they also had some concerns about regulation, so I guess that's something that also needs to be addressed, where it's a sort of middle area between the industry, the regulator, and government. They also talked about the need to make sure that's functioning as effectively as possible as well.
No, that is very clear. And now, by the way, if people don't want to submit questions on the iPad that comes to me, do feel free to do it the old-fashioned way and put a hand up if you have a burning question. But while you think about that, Carol, just one other one, which might not have come through in this research because of the timing, but may have come through since. I mean, is there a sort of emerging picture or general change in sentiment in public and business opinion since the budget? Have you picked that up?
Yes, we showed the slide from the piece of polling we did for Politics Home, where it's a real dive in positivity about the UK. I think we always knew it was going to be challenging, but I don't know, the message that everything is really bad may have been a little bit overplayed to the public. I don't know if that's true. What we may see is it was a canny message because things get better and the public feel better about everything. But we did see a lot of doom and gloom and negativity after a bit of an uptick from the public. And that will actually impact people's behaviours. It'll impact their confidence. It'll impact. We heard from SMEs that we were doing research with a real sense, I don't want to make any decisions till after the budget. And then when the budget happened, I think a lot of people didn't actually feel it had been that bad, but were sort of steeling themselves for it and had created a bit of a sort of negative mindset. Actually, I think post-budget, people haven't actually seen it as being as negative as they thought it might have been. But they're still now waiting to see what comes next and looking for some sort of positivity in the world.
So it's this kind of fine line that the government is trying to walk between expectation management and not creating a self-fulfilling negative prophecy, if you like. And the public have been through a lot over the last few years. It's easy for us to kind of forget the terrible upheaval. I mean, the pandemic wasn't that long ago. And there has been a lot of uncertainty and a lot of difficulty, and there are a lot of people who have difficulties in their lives. So it's kind of easy for us. It's not just a news cycle. Some people are really feeling quite down about the world or have gone through some very difficult years. And we don't want sort of false positivity. People do also, I think, need to see some sort of optimistic stories in the future or see that there's some hope for the future, particularly given that it has been a really difficult 5 years for many people. And that, I think, again, kind of absolutely underscores, one of the jobs for our industry, which is to communicate the upside potential without, putting too much of a sort of Pollyanna-ish gloss on it. But we can emphasize what we can do to deliver, that future success in the broader economy. And again, to go back to your earlier point, I mean, it's fantastic you break this down regionally because I suspect what came through is a sort of meaningful sense among politicians that if we can deliver visible, tangible, inclusive success on the ground for people, then our industry will be valued even more. Is that a fair assumption?
I think so. And I think the industry shouldn't be too shy about really promoting some of the things they do that feels really relevant to the public, the sort of human stories, the amount of investment and support they do through different initiatives. It is actually, I think, a real success story, how people now feel much more connected to their finances through digitization. We often hear the opposite side, that, branch closures are really bad, but actually the average person in the street now, I think, feels sort of more control and more connected to their providers. And I know there's lots of great initiatives that happen. I guess the thing with the public need those human stories, but the industry, I don't think, should be shy in telling those human stories because it does do a huge amount of good and make a huge amount of difference to people's lives, and they recognise that. But I don't know if the stories are always really told. Yeah,
it comes through in the job count and some of the evidence that we have of our engagement as a sector in skills, apprenticeships, and so on. Some of the things we've heard about today, we can really make an impact. So we're almost out of time, Carol, but I think that has been a really, really helpful set of insights for us at City UK and for the audience.
Please send some questions in. Anything you want to ask, what am I doing for Christmas?
Fantastic, right, okay. I thought Miles was telling me to wind up and get off the stage, but it was the opposite, right? More. There are a couple of hands up, thank goodness, right, okay. There was one over there. Yeah, Andrew.
Mike. Thanks, Carol. That was fascinating. I just want to get your perspective on the industrial strategy and when that comes out. So we've got these 8 pillars, of course, of which financial and professional services will be one key one and hopefully an enabling one. How do you think the public will react to that? Do you think there's an opportunity to really, for these 8 pillars to really sort of start to make positive noise about their individual industries and tell those stories and for maybe the country as a whole and regions around certain pillars to really feel that they get behind them? Should we be thinking about that as a potential upside?
Absolutely. I think it's been really clear, the narrative from the government, from the new government, about the role of the industry, the importance of the industry. And I don't think that's necessarily influenced the public trust being higher per se, but I do think it creates a halo effect, and there's a really positive story to be told there. And also just thinking about the sector as one, for example, who might want to work in themselves. I think it's absolutely positive. I guess the only other thing I'd flag is for the vast majority of the public, they don't engage with these types of details, so they won't know what's in this at all. But for those who are engaged in it, or if there's a way to tell that story, it is really positive that the industry's there. And that's why we said it is a time of opportunity. And a time, I think, to be positive and to jump on some of these opportunities and think about what that means. As I say, doing nothing is the worst thing you can do. So yes, there's some real positive stories to be told.
Thanks. And I think there was one last question from the middle, and then we will wind up. But please.
Hi, it was interesting what you said about the financial crash being a distant memory. When roughly did that happen? Did the Liz Truss budget think maybe bankers are okay and the politicians don't quite know what they're doing with the finances? Just wanted to know if there was a sort of a line, a moment when you thought, actually, this is when the sea change is going to happen. Yeah,
I think you've had the benefit of some other sectors or institutions having even less trust than they had before 2008. But I do think it's also a bit of a generational thing. We saw when I looked at the data by demographics and age, the level of trust is actually really high amongst young people. So I think there's also an element of it just has no relevance to them. They haven't seen this happen and they don't have concerns about the industry in the same way. But I guess that's the thing about not being complacent, because we wouldn't want that to then happen again in a cyclical sort of way that could see.
Well, that is a great note on which to end. Young people love financial services. So, Carol, thank you very much for your contribution.